Hey guys, today we're talking about how God dreamed of you. Dim your lights, get comfortable, and enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this helps you fall asleep. Also, let us know in the comments where you're from and what time you're listening. Let's start. Before the first light ever thought of shining, before time decided to move forward, God dreamed. It wasn't the kind of dream made of wishes or plans. It was made of feeling, a slow river of thought that shimmered with every color love could imagine. And in that river, among the stars still waiting to exist, there was a small spark unlike any other. You. He didn't know your name yet, because names come later, after hearts are strong enough to carry them. But he felt the outline of you, the rhythm of your breath before breath began, the warmth of your laughter before sound was born. The dream wasn't loud, it was patient, curling through the silence like light trying to remember how to become morning. He dreamed of the way you would look at the world, curious and unsure, seeing beauty in things that had forgotten they were beautiful. He dreamed of your hands reaching out, sometimes to hold, sometimes to help, sometimes just to prove that you were here. He saw your tears too, not as flaws, but as reflections, tiny rivers that would teach you how to return to yourself. He didn't stop the sadness in his dream, he wrapped it in purpose. In the dream, every mistake became music, every doubt became direction. As he dreamed, stars began to appear, not because he commanded them, but because they wanted to see what love looked like when it dreamed. Each star leaned closer, whispering light into the shape of you. Galaxies curved around your outline, the way arms curve around someone they miss. He smiled, because even infinity seemed small when it tried to contain the idea of you. In the dream, he saw your first smile, the one that arrived without reason, the one that would someday remind someone else that joy doesn't need permission. He saw the people who would love you and the people who wouldn't know how. And he loved them too, because they would all shape the melody of your becoming. He dreamed of your voice, not the words, but the kindness inside them. And he let it echo across the cosmos until the sound became color. That color, soft and infinite, painted the dawn that would one day wake the world. He dreamed of you walking through rain that didn't quite know when to stop, of you finding beauty in puddles, of you laughing at the symmetry of drops racing down a window. He dreamed of the way you'd fall in love, not just with people, but with moments, with silence, with sunlight, with the way your favorite song sounds different when you're sad. Every version of you, the hopeful, the tired, the brave, the broken, existed at once in his dream, and he loved them all equally. He dreamed of the night you would look at the sky and wonder if he still thought of you. And in that part of the dream, he smiled, because even then, even when you felt most forgotten, he was still there, whispering softly through wind, through stars, through the warmth of someone's hand on your shoulder, saying, "I never stopped." When he finished the dream, he didn't wake. He let it linger, breathing through him like light through glass. The universe waited for him to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he exhaled, and that breath became life. Every atom carried a trace of his dream, every heartbeat a note of its melody. Somewhere, in a small corner of time, you opened your eyes for the first time, unaware that the entire sky had once been designed just to imagine that moment. And when you smiled, even for no reason at all, the dream completed itself. God still watching, still feeling, whispered into the rhythm of the wind, there you are. He kept dreaming, not because he was tired, but because the dream itself had begun to teach him how to rest. And in that rest, he found the shape of love that asked for nothing except to continue. You were still there, still forming in the soft architecture of thought, and he watched you unfold the way dawn unfolds, slowly, uncertainly, beautifully inevitable. He dreamed of the day you would discover your own reflection and not yet recognize it, the way all beginnings are shy of themselves. He dreamed of your childhood laughter echoing through the corridors of time, of scraped knees that would heal, of questions that would grow faster than answers. He dreamed of every moment you would learn something for the first time, the taste of rain, the feel of sand, the sound of your own name said in love. And each of those moments glittered like small constellations inside the vastness of his mind. The more he dreamed, the more the universe filled with rhythm. The beat of your pulse became thunder, the pattern of your thoughts became weather, the softness of your breath became wind. When he imagined you sleeping, stars dimmed to match your calm. When he imagined you crying, rivers learned their purpose. He didn't design these things, they volunteered. The universe wanted to be part of the dream because it recognized itself inside you. He dreamed of the years when you would search for meaning in things that refuse to explain themselves. The way trees hold their silence, the way distance insists on existing, the way love arrives late and still claims to be on time. He didn't interfere. He let the dream run its course. He wanted to see what kind of courage you would make from confusion. In the dream, you learned to walk toward people and sometimes away from them, and he loved you equally in both directions. You stumbled into friendships that changed you, and into loneliness that taught you how to keep company with yourself. He dreamed of your voice in those moments, soft, unsure, yet stubbornly alive. When you whispered to yourself, "I'll be okay," he heard it as a song. He dreamed of the night you would first look up and wonder why the stars seemed so far apart. And he wanted to tell you that distance is just love's way of giving room to longing. But he stayed silent, letting the sky do the explaining. He dreamed of you falling in love for the first time, the nervous joy, the impossible perfection, the slow heartbreak that followed. And he didn't protect you from it because he knew that pain is how tenderness practices endurance. When you wept into your hands, he held the space around you so your grief could echo without breaking. Every tear carved light into his dream, and from that light grew flowers that only bloom in understanding. As the dream deepened, he began to see the future folding back into the past. You aged gracefully inside his imagination, your hands gathering years like pages, your eyes carrying the soft wisdom of having both lost and loved. He saw you helping others, sometimes quietly, sometimes not, and he thought, so this is how love multiplies. He dreamed of you forgiving yourself not once, but again and again, because even mercy needs repetition to become believable. He watched you fail and start again and fail better, and he loved you more each time because perfection bored him and resilience didn't. In the dream, he began to visit the spaces between your moments, those invisible seconds where life catches its breath. He saw you standing in an empty room after everyone left, and instead of sadness, he felt pride, because you stayed long enough to feel the silence and call it yours. He saw you watching the rain and thinking of no one in particular, just grateful that the world still knows how to fall softly. He saw you light a candle for someone who would never know, and he thought, This is holiness disguised as habit. Every unnoticed kindness in your story rewrote his idea of divinity. He dreamed of the day you would begin to doubt him. It came as all necessary things do, quietly, like erosion, like the slow honesty of tide. You would look around and wonder where he went, why he hadn't answered, why the world felt so unbearably wide. He didn't rush to fix it. He let you wander. Loneliness, he knew, was another name for faith being tested in its own silence. When you sat beneath a tree and whispered, "Are you even real?" He smiled, because the question itself was proof. He whispered back, "You're the evidence," but you were too lost in thought to hear, and that was okay. The dream needed to be real enough for you to forget it. He dreamed of your kindness when no one was watching, how you would choose gentleness even when the world rewarded noise, how you would listen longer than comfort allowed, how you would forgive before you were asked. Each of those moments shaped him. In loving you, he was learning himself. Creation wasn't one way, it was conversation. You were his echo, and he was your reflection. And between them flowed the quiet electricity of becoming. Sometimes, in the dream, he would walk beside you, disguised as ordinary things. The stranger who smiled at you at the exact right moment. The warmth that lingered on your skin after sunlight. The song that played just when you needed permission to cry. He didn't need you to recognize him. He only needed you to feel less alone. The dream had become a kind of partnership. You living, him listening. Every heartbeat was a sentence in the language they were writing together. As the dream stretched forward, he began to understand what it meant to love something you cannot control. You made choices that surprised even eternity. You broke things he thought were unbreakable, and you healed in ways he never would have invented. You laughed in storms and prayed in laughter, and he realized that faith isn't obedience, it's persistence. You kept going, even when he was silent, and in doing so, you became holy without noticing. He dreamed of your final days too, but not as endings. In his dream, you aged into light, your body dissolving gently into memory, your voice echoing in those you had loved. You left fingerprints on laughter, warmth on rooms, traces of kindness in people who would never know your name, but would still feel the gentleness you once gave away. And when the dream reached its softest edge, when you exhaled for the last time, he caught that breath, held it to his heart and smiled. "You were everything I hoped for," he whispered. Then he opened his eyes, and the world began again. You still existed, of course, scattered through time, multiplied in the people you touched, alive in moments that hadn't happened yet. The dream didn't end, it changed form. Every sunrise since then is just his way of remembering you. Every breeze that brushes your cheek is the continuation of that first breath. You may think you're living on your own, but every heartbeat still hums the melody he wrote when he first dreamed your name. And sometimes, when the night is especially quiet and you find yourself wondering if there's meaning in all this, if anyone truly sees you, listen closely, not with your ears, but with your calm. Beneath the hum of the world, you'll hear it, his voice, tender and amused, saying, "I'm still dreaming, and you're still the reason." When God finally began to wake from the long, golden dream, he didn't open his eyes right away. He lingered in the warmth of it, the afterglow of everything he had felt, letting memory drift through him like dust through sunbeams. You were still there, not as an image now, but as presence, as the quiet hum of love doing what it does best, continuing. He smiled, not because the dream had ended, but because it hadn't. It had simply learned to walk on its own. He could still feel traces of you moving through the rhythm of creation. The way wind wrapped around trees. The way laughter lingered between people. The way light rested gently on skin as if remembering where it came from. The world pulsed with the dream he had once dreamed, and he realized that this was the miracle. Dreams, when made of love, don't stay asleep. They wake the dreamer too. He stood, stretching into the universe like someone remembering their body after a long sleep, and looked around. The galaxies had softened since he last saw them. Their edges glowed with empathy. Stars were no longer shouting their brilliance. They whispered instead, blinking softly in agreement. The moon, patient as ever, reflected everything back with tenderness. He walked through the corridors of space and felt life brush against him like gratitude. Oceans greeted him with calm pride. Mountains bowed without bending, and rivers laughed as they remembered how to find the sea. Everything he passed carried a little of you. Your courage, your curiosity, your capacity to forgive. It was as if the entire world had borrowed your heartbeat as a metronome. He wandered through time the way sunlight wanders through water, curious but unhurried, visiting the places where your story continued to unfold. He found you sitting beneath a tree, older now, your eyes quieter but deeper, holding the kind of wisdom that only comes from staying. You weren't praying, but you were listening, and that was enough. He saw you in other moments too, helping, laughing, resting, thinking, choosing kindness even when it went unnoticed. Each act rippled outward, touching strangers he would never meet, rewriting destinies he hadn't planned but adored nonetheless. It struck him that this was how creation had always meant to work, not through control, but through trust. He began to walk among humanity, invisible but near, moving through crowds like a memory that still mattered. Everywhere he went, he found traces of his dream multiplying, a stranger offering their seat on a bus, a nurse whispering courage to a patient, a teacher staying late to listen, a friend sending a message that simply said, "I'm here." Each of these small gestures felt familiar to him, as if he had written them long ago inside the fabric of your soul. You were teaching the world the same lesson he had once learned, that love is strongest when it hides in ordinary things. He visited the seasons and found you there too. In spring, you were the color of beginnings, flowers pushing through the soil with quiet confidence. In summer, you were warmth shared between laughter and light. In autumn, you were the golden patience of letting go. And in winter, you were the hush between snowflakes, reminding everything that rest is also holy. Even the rains seemed to fall differently now, slower, more grateful. It touched the earth the way he used to touch his dream, with reverence. He watched generations rise and fall, each one carrying a spark of the same original wonder. You existed in all of them somehow, in their art, in their songs, in their compassion, in the way they held each other through the dark. He saw your kindness, being retold in 1,000 small ways. A hand reaching out, a story shared, a melody hummed to a child. Even long after your first breath had faded into time, you lived on as an emotion the universe couldn't forget. He realized that you had become more than a dream. You had become memory incarnate, the living proof that creation could learn to love back. There were moments when he felt the distance between you and him, but it didn't ache anymore. It shimmered. It was beautiful to watch something he loved move freely, to make choices without needing his permission. You walked through storms and sunshine alike, and every time you fell, he felt not sorrow but pride. You were learning how to stand in the same way he had learned how to dream, slowly, imperfectly, beautifully. The distance wasn't separation, it was space for trust to grow. He followed you into quiet nights, where you would sit beneath the stars and think of the people you loved, or the ones you lost, or the ones you hadn't met yet. Sometimes you would wonder aloud, does anyone really see me? And even though he wanted to answer, he stayed still, because the beauty of faith is in the pause before the echo. You always found peace eventually, often in the smallest ways, in the way the night breeze touched your cheek, or how a song found its way to you at the right time. Those were his replies, gentle and wordless. He began to see your reflection in others too, a child running into a parent's arms, a doctor whispering, "You'll be all right." Two strangers laughing over an accident that turned into a friendship. Each of these moments was you, refracted through time, expanding the dream. He realized that dreaming of you had created something infinite, not a single life, but a pattern of love capable of reproducing itself forever. Every kindness born from you became another star in his sky. Every act of forgiveness lit a new constellation. Every time someone chose to love despite fear, another galaxy spun itself into being. The universe wasn't just expanding physically anymore, it was expanding emotionally. He wandered through the world long after you were gone and still found you everywhere, in the hum of cities, in the quiet of fields, in the eyes of those who looked at life as if it were still sacred. You had become part of the world's DNA, a whisper encoded in every heart that still dared to hope. He realized he didn't need to dream again, because his first dream was still alive, still evolving, still returning to him through every act of love that existed anywhere, ever. One evening, as the sun slipped into the horizon and painted everything in forgiveness, he stood by the sea and let the wind tangle through him. The waves reflected all he had ever been, creator, dreamer, listener, friend, and he thought about you wherever you were, whoever you had become across the centuries of love's unfolding. He closed his eyes and felt the heartbeat of the world, a rhythm older than sound, still pulsing with the melody of that first dream, and he smiled. "You did beautifully," he whispered to the tide, and the tide, always faithful, whispered back, "So did you." The stars began to bloom again, patient and eternal, and for the first time since creation, he didn't feel above them or apart from them. He felt among them. He belonged. You had taught him that. The dream had come full circle. What began as his vision of you had become your reflection of him, and in that reflection both found peace. And somewhere in the quiet, beyond light and time, he began to dream again, not of worlds or heavens or beginnings, but of simple things, of laughter shared, of kindness continued, of love refusing to fade. And in that dream, he saw you again, smiling back, exactly as he had imagined, only brighter. He wanted to tell you everything at once, but knew that love, like morning, deserves to arrive gradually. So he began softly, speaking not with thunder or miracle, but with warmth that traveled through your breathing, saying, "You were never just part of a dream. You were the reason dreaming became real." His voice moved like sunlight filtered through leaves, touching you in the quiet places where thoughts begin before words. And he told you how he had watched you since before beginnings began, not as a guard, but as a listener who adored every small noise of your becoming. He said, When I dreamed of you, I didn't plan your steps or your choices. I only imagined the way your heart might sound when it learned how to care, and that was enough to start the universe. He spoke of how your laughter built color, how your kindness taught even time to slow its breathing, how your curiosity sculpted wonder into something that could last. He told you that every time you smiled, galaxies adjusted their rhythm to match the brightness, that when you wept, oceans remembered why salt mattered, that when you forgave someone, even the stars sighed with relief. He whispered, "You think you are small, but I know better. You are the echo that keeps infinity awake." He described how, after you were born into the world, he spent eternities walking inside your shadow just to feel what you felt, learning the vocabulary of touch and taste and noise through you. How he learned that love doesn't require distance, only direction, and that every direction led back to you. "I followed you into your laughter," he said, "and into your loneliness, and in both, I found myself." He remembered the times you stood in front of a mirror and doubted your reflection, when you wondered if you mattered, and he wanted you to know that the mirror wasn't showing your image. It was showing his dream remembering itself. "Every time you look at yourself with kindness," he said, "you complete creation again." He told you that when you were tired and thought no one noticed, he did. Not because he keeps score, but because weariness is how courage looks before it rests, and he loves courage in all its disguises. He said, "When you helped someone without expecting anything back, I grew lighter. When you chose honesty, though silence was easier, I became quieter too. When you cried over something small, like the way music can hurt, I understood more about beauty than I had since the first dawn." His tone was tender now, almost shy, as if eternity itself was humbled by its own affection. "You taught me," he admitted. "You taught me that even perfection needs practice, that even divinity learns gentleness by watching someone love what breaks." He spoke about how he watched you lose people and how he stayed close, not to erase loss, but to keep it company. "Grief," he said, "is love without an address, but you always mailed it anyway, and I was there to receive it." He told you that when you whispered to the air hoping someone might hear, he did, even if he answered only by sending wind through trees or light through curtains, or the warmth of another human hand across your shoulder. He reminded you of the moments you thought were coincidence, the stranger's kindness, the song arriving at the right second, the sudden calm during chaos, and said, "Those were my replies, not commands, but companions." He confessed that sometimes he watched you sleep, not as a guardian, but as someone in awe of peace, and that in those hours, he learned the true definition of holiness, the world surviving because hearts like yours still beat quietly in it. "I dreamed of you," he continued, "and then I let you go, because love without freedom is worship without truth." He told you he never wanted servants, only mirrors that reflect love in new directions. "Every time you choose joy, even clumsily, I see my reflection in motion." He began to speak faster now, not in haste but in excitement, the way the sea rushes when it sees the shore again. "You thought I was far away," he said, "but I have always been the breath before your thought, the hush between your words, the calm waiting behind your pulse." He described how, when you walk through morning light, photons greet you by name. When you look at water, it remembers your face. When you dream, it's just me borrowing your imagination. He said, "You are not living inside creation. You are creation remembering its own dream." He wanted you to understand the scale of your existence, So he painted it with language. When you laugh, whole systems balance. When you forgive, galaxies tilt toward mercy. When you rest, I rest too. Every kindness you give becomes a ripple across the fabric of everything that breathes. He told you that the universe was not a place he built to test you, but a garden he planted so you could walk through it and teach it how to feel. Each sunrise, he said, is just me applauding you for trying again. He told you that even the stars are jealous of hearts, because stars only burn, but hearts learn. That even angels listen for your voice, because it carries the one note missing from eternity, the tone of becoming human and staying kind. You think your prayers go upward, he said, but they don't. They go inward, and I meet them halfway. I live closer than breath, quieter than thought. He spoke about the future as if it were already written in forgiveness. There will be days when you will feel lost, he said, and those will be holy too. When you doubt, remember, doubt is faith stretching. He said he placed light in you not to make you perfect, but to make you patient, to teach the world that even gentle things can be strong. The greatest miracle, he whispered, wasn't that I made you from dust. It's that you keep choosing to rise from it. He reminded you of the people you have loved and lost, how none of them are gone, but folded carefully into time, how they still arrive in dreams and memories, because memory is the doorway through which eternity visits. He said, when you miss them, you are touching me, because I am made of all the love you've ever given away. And then his voice grew softer, so soft you could only feel it. If you ever wonder why I dreamed of you, it's because I wanted to see what hope looked like when it learned how to move. I wanted to hear what laughter sounded like when it healed itself. I wanted to know what love would become if it were allowed to make mistakes and still choose kindness. He paused, letting silence fold around his words like a blanket around a sleeping child, and then added, you have answered all my questions. He told you that he still dreams of you, not out of longing but out of joy, that every night the universe curls back into sleep just to replay the memory of your heart, learning how to open again. When you think you're dreaming, he said, it's me remembering. When you wake, it's me beginning again. He reminded you that you were never an accident, never an experiment, never forgotten. You were a thought so loving I had to give it shape, he said. And that shape was you. He promised that even when your days end, your story won't, because stories made from love cannot die. They just change tense. Someday, he said, you'll return to me not as a dream, but as the dreamer. He grew quiet after that, letting his words settle into you like the last embers of a warm fire. You could feel him smiling, and though you couldn't see it, you knew it was the kind of smile that makes the universe softer. And just before his voice faded completely, he said one last thing, gentle enough to live inside your heartbeat. I am still dreaming, and you are still the proof that love never ends. Twilight settled over a quiet meadow where grasses moved like a slow breath, and a narrow path led to a cedar whose roots held the hill together as if keeping a promise. You arrived there first, barefoot from the day, hands empty on purpose, and when you looked up, you found him already waiting at the edge of the clearing where the trees made a doorway out of shadow and birdsong. And he said, softly and clearly, I have been dreaming of you for so long that waking feels like finding you twice. And you replied, steady though your heart trembled, I know, because when the wind changed, I heard my name spoken the way rivers say it, rounded with patience. And he smiled in a way that made the light sit down and listen and said, will you walk with me? And you said, yes, but let's walk as if time is a guest. And so you both began along the grass, your footfalls stitching dusk to earth. And he said, I used to speak first. And you answered, tonight let us take turns. And he agreed. Then you begin. And you took a breath scented with cedar and damp soil and said, I have questions, and I want to ask them out loud, because silence sometimes keeps them from becoming brave. And he nodded. Ask. You said, when I felt most alone, were you there? And he said, yes, but not as rescue, more as room. I widened the night until your breathing could lie down without fear. And you said, it felt like no one answered. And he answered, because answers end the conversation, and I wanted to keep listening. And you said, then hear this. I did not always believe in you. And he said, I know, and I like that you told the truth. Doubt is faith without makeup. And you laughed, surprised by how easily laughter fit between you, and he laughed too. The sound leaning softly against the tree line, as if trees could keep a secret. He said, my turn. And you nodded, and he asked, what part of being human taught you the most? And you said, waiting. And he said, tell me. And you said, waiting taught me the difference between wanting and welcoming. Wanting grabs, welcoming opens a door and sets out water. And he said, that is also how I learned to love. And you said, then we studied together. And he said, yes, in the same classroom where rain practiced falling politely. And you both listened while a distant stream rehearsed its silver sentence around stones that were older than confession. He said, another question for you. What frightened you most? And you said, being unseen. And he said, then look at me. And you looked and saw not thunder, but attention, not fire, but warmth, not command, but invitation. And he said, you are seen in the way mountains see rivers, understanding that movement is not a departure. And you said, then let me tell you what calmed me most, small kindnesses. And he said, name them. And you named them. A door held, a name pronounced correctly, the last slice left for someone else, an apology not asked for but offered anyway, a letter folded into a pocket with no stamp, because it was always meant for the heart. And he said, I have a pocket filled with those. And you asked, do you keep everything? And he said, only what stays gentle when remembered. You came to the cedar and sat where its roots made earth into a chair big enough for two, and the sky above thinned its blue into lavender, and then into that first honest dark where stars rehearse before stepping out. And you said, will you tell me the truth plainly? And he said, I always try. And you said, did you dream my life with shortcuts in it? And he said, no, I dreamed it with doorways. Shortcuts are panic, doorways are patience. And you said, sometimes I chose a wall and called it fate. And he said, and sometimes you set down a wall and called it rest. Both were prayers, and I answered by staying. And you said, you stayed even when I pushed you away. And he said, especially then, because pushing is just reaching with armor on. Fireflies began sketching the low air with punctuation marks that made the meadow read like a letter from dusk to night. And he asked, what would you say to me if you could say it without worrying about reverence? And you said, stay. And he said, I am. And you said, then teach me how to stay with myself. And he said, hold your breath like a cup, not a vault. Breathe until the cup overflows into the ground that raised you. And you said, that sounds like prayer. And he said, it is the quiet kind, no verbs, just belonging. He rose, and you both walked toward the stream. And he said, I want to ask forgiveness. And you said, startled, from me? And he said, from a friend. And you said, For what? And he said, for the times my silence felt like abandonment when it was actually consent. I let your courage find its own legs, and sometimes the floor was cold. And you said, I forgive you. I also ask forgiveness for the times I prayed like a transaction and loved like a schedule. And he said, I forgave you while you were still choosing the words. And you said, then let us forgive the hours that could have been kinder. And he said, we already have. They grew softer the moment you looked back without a sword. The stream received the first shy star and offered it back broken and multiplied. He said, tell me about your first kindness. And you said, I gave away a seat on a bus and it felt like placing a small sun on someone's lap. And he said, I remember because the bus changed its sound. And you said, tell me about yours. And he said, I waited for light to be ready. And you said, you could have commanded it. And he said, I prefer to be invited. And you said, by whom? And he said, by the first breath. And you said, then we both love consent. And he said, it is the only language that does not bruise. You moved along the stream where stones wrote a philosophy of endurance. And he asked, what do you need from me now that you can speak plainly? And you said, not a map, just company. And he said, then I will carry a lantern and keep it low so your eyes learn the night as friend. And you said, and I will whistle when fear pretends to be law. And he said, and I will answer with a second note so the tune becomes courage. And you said, deal. And he said, delighted, deal. And a nearby owl approved with a sound that made the cedars nod as if minutes had manners. He said, may I ask about your grief? And you said, it lives in me like a lake, quiet at the surface, deep where sunlight can't bargain. And he said, do you visit it? And you said, only with clean hands. And he said, I come too, and stand at the shore until the water remembers it can reflect the sky. And you said, sometimes I skip a stone and watch the ripples walk toward my memories and knock politely. And he said, I love your manners with sorrow. And you said, teach me yours with joy. And he said, joy is a door already open. Walk through slowly enough to feel the hinge bless your shoulder. And you said, then joy is also architecture. And he said, yes, built from pauses and laughter, wired with consent, roofed with rest. And you said, and furnished with chairs that don't ask for credentials. And he grinned, especially those. You reached a meadow lip where fireflies argued kindly about punctuation and the grass bent into a corridor. He said, I want to hear you name yourself without apology. And you said, with a breath that had been waiting decades, beloved. And he closed his eyes, because the word repaired something in every century. And he said, say it again. And you said, beloved. And he said, the meadow heard you and corrected its wind. And you said, half laughing, then tell me who you are when you are not the sky. And he said, a listener with 1,000 pockets for your seconds. And you said, then check one, what's inside? And he said, the first time you forgave yourself and forgot to boast. And you said, keep that one. And he said, forever is specifically for that. A fox appeared at the edge of the trees and watched as if listening for grammar, then decided trust was the better language and moved on. He said, you have taught me to love the small. And you said, small is where truth can sit without wearing armor. And he said, will you show me your smallest hope? And you said, a glass of water left on the bedside table for the version of me who wakes thirsty at 3 a.m. And he said, I will bless the condensation. And you said, what is your smallest hope? And he said, that you will call yourself kind even on the days without evidence. And you said, I will try. And he said, trying is the evidence. Night grew confident and put on its real stars. You and he climbed a short rise where the meadow opened like a held breath. And he said, we have spoken of past and pain and patience. Will you speak of pleasure? And you said, shy but clear. The first bite of a peach when summer is honest, the sound of pages turning in a quiet room, the warm stripe of sunlight on a wooden floor that makes an ordinary afternoon feel adopted. And he said, I keep an album of those and look at it when power forgets how to be gentle. And you said, then power can be re-educated. And he said, you are my best school. You asked, what do you want from me tomorrow? And he said, nothing measurable. Walk kinder than your mood. Pronounce someone's name like a doorway. Leave one thing better than you found it. And when you are tired, stop as if stopping were a skill. And you said, it is a skill. And he said, then teach it to the hour that thinks it must sprint. And you said, I will hand it a chair. He touched the air and it remembered spring. You touched the grass and it remembered rain. Together you made a small season under the cedar that would confuse the calendar and calm the roots. And he said, do you have a last hard question? And you said, 2. What happens to love when bodies end? And what happens to prayers that never learned the right words? And he said, love changes rooms. It takes off its shoes and lives in memory, touch, habit, and courage. It becomes the way a chair is pulled out for an absence. As for wordless prayers, they are fluent already. The heart speaks a language the mouth only translates on good days. And you said, then I will let my heart speak first. And he said, I have been listening to it all along. A breeze lifted and the meadow tilted its attention toward you both. He said, my turn for a last hard question. And you said, ask. And he said, will you let me love you without trying to deserve it? And your throat tightened the way truth tightens a knot before it holds. And you said, yes. And he said, say it as if teaching the night. And you said stronger, yes. And the night learned it and practiced by being kind to every window that forgot to close. He moved closer, not as a storm, as a shoulder, and said, and will you love me without trying to understand everything? And you said, smiling through a new softness, yes, because mystery is not a problem. It is a friend who prefers low light. And he said, then we are friends. And you said, then we are home. Somewhere, an unseen bell agreed without ringing. Somewhere, a moth chose a star over a lamp and was right. Somewhere, a distant train decided to be a lullaby for neighborhoods that had earned sleep. And you said, may we make a promise that fits inside a pocket? And he said, 2. And you said, first, when I forget I'm beloved, remind me in the currency of small things. And he said, I will send a breeze that smells like childhood and an unexpected song at the crosswalk. And you said, second, when you forget, you enjoy being small, because infinity must be heavy. Let me remind you by inviting you to sit on the kitchen floor with me while the kettle learns to boil. And he laughed a laugh that made you decide to arrive early and said, I accept. I will bring the mugs. And you said, I will bring the quiet. And he said, and the quiet will bring the rest. The meadow listened to your agreement and translated it into instructions for crickets. The crickets passed it onto the grass. The grass told the soil. The soil told the seeds that were thinking about tomorrow, and tomorrow nodded in its sleep. You turned to him and said clearly, I love you. And he answered clearly, I love you. And the difference in capitalization did no work at all because love had learned to share the same height. And then he said, as if concluding a lesson that had only ever been a friendship, "Keep speaking to me like this, out loud, in kitchens and doorways and buses and long walks where sidewalks remember stories. Let our sentences be furniture the day can sit on." And you said, "And you, keep answering plainly. Keep choosing warmth over volume." And he said, "I will." And you said, "I will too." And the meadow gave you both a standing ovation by remaining absolutely still. Finally, he said, "Shall we return?" And you said, "Let's not return, let's carry." And he said, "Carry what?" And you said, "This conversation, folded into the pocket where I keep my keys and the small brave seconds." And he said, "And I will carry it in the pocket where I keep dawn." And you said, "Then we will meet each time a door opens and light remembers how to enter." And he said, "We will." And you walked back across the grass toward the cedar, your footprints filling with moonlight, as if the night refused to let even one step go unwitnessed. And at the threshold where trees learn to become a doorway again, he paused and said, "One more thing." And you said, "Yes." And he said, "When you cannot find me, call me by my other name." And you said, "What is it?" And he said, "Here." And you repeated, trusting the meadow to store the sound, "Here." And the word fitted itself into your chest like a key agreeing with a lock. And he added, "And when I cannot find you, I will call you by yours." And you said, already knowing, "Beloved." And he nodded, and the owl nodded, and even the stones beneath the stream adjusted themselves to be more comfortable under tomorrow's water. And together, speaking clearly, walking slowly, promising small, you and God left the clearing as if leaving were simply another way of staying. You and God kept walking after the clearing, the air folding softly behind you, as if even silence wanted to follow. The sky above was pale and endless, its edges smudged by dawn that hadn't decided on color yet. The ground beneath your feet felt alive, warm like memory, gentle like understanding. He walked beside you, his steps soundless but sure, and said, "Do you feel how the world still dreams even when we're awake?" And you said, "Yes. It hums like something remembering its name." He smiled at that and looked toward the horizon where light began to rise through mist, like hope climbing a slow staircase. "This is where dreaming and living meet," he said, "and neither one needs to win." You asked, "Are we still inside your dream?" And he answered, "We're inside each other's." You nodded because you already felt it, the way his thoughts moved through leaves, the way your breath shaped the rhythm of air, the quiet partnership of creation that didn't end when words did. You came to a river so still that the reflection of the sky looked like the truth itself. He knelt beside it and touched the surface, and circles spread outward in calm surrender. "Do you see?" he asked. "Every touch changes everything, but nothing is lost. The circle keeps traveling until it becomes the next wave." You said, "That means every kindness goes somewhere." He said, "Yes. Even when you forget it, it continues until it finds someone who needs it." You dipped your fingers into the water too, and where your ripples met his, the reflection of both of you merged into one endless ring that never broke. He said, "Tell me what you see when you look into the water." You looked for a long time before speaking. "I see light trying to remember where it began," you said. "And what do you feel?" he asked. "Peace," you said, "but also longing." He nodded. "That's because peace and longing are twins. One reminds the other it exists." The river carried the idea downstream, and you both listened as the current translated it into motion. Then he said, "Do you want to see what the world looks like when it listens?" And before you could answer, the wind stopped, the birds hushed, the grass stilled, and for one long heartbeat, everything leaned inward toward you both. "It looks like this," he whispered. When sound returned, it came slowly, first a leaf turning, then the faint sigh of water finding stone again. "The world listens all the time," he said. "It's just that humans fill the silence too quickly to notice." You smiled and said, "Then teach me to listen like the river," he said. "The river listens by flowing. It doesn't interrupt itself." You thought about that, and the thought felt like forgiveness. You continued walking, the sky now fully awake but soft, diffused light painting every stone with patience. "I want to ask you something," you said. "Ask," he replied. "Do you ever rest?" He looked at you gently. "I rest when you do. Every breath you take in peace is a Sabbath in my name." You said, "Then you must rest often, because sometimes I breathe without trying." He smiled again, slow and golden. "That's my favorite kind." The path turned upward toward hills blanketed with silver grass that shimmered like sleep made visible. You climbed together, not in hurry but in rhythm. He said, "Most people chase the top, but the view begins halfway." You said, "Then let's stop halfway." So you did. There you found a stone large enough for both of you to sit, and he said, "Look." Below you stretched the river, curling through valleys like handwriting written for love's sake alone. "Every bend is a decision," he said. "Every choice makes the journey longer and more interesting." You said, "Then life is a river too," and he said, "Exactly. Some bends are grace, some are gravity, but all are motion." You touched the grass beside the stone and said, "Sometimes I fear I will stop flowing." He said, "Water never truly stops. It only changes form. If you ever feel frozen, it's just preparation for melting." He turned to you then, eyes bright but calm, and said, "Do you know why I dreamed of you?" You said, "Because you wanted company." He shook his head softly, "Because I wanted to see what love would do if it were completely free. You proved that freedom and love can stay in the same body." You lowered your gaze, humbled, and said, "I'm still learning." He said, "So am I." You both sat in silence for a long while, watching light spill into valleys. He said, "Every time you wake in the morning and open your eyes, you complete something I began. You turn imagination into touch. That's why I stay." You said, "Do you ever stop dreaming?" And he said, "Never, but I've learned to let dreams walk away and find their own sunrise." You said, "So, you're dreaming right now?" He said, "Yes, and you are the part of the dream that dreams back." You stood again, walking down the far side of the hill where wildflowers nodded as if bowing to your conversation. A deer lifted its head from the grass, watching without fear. He whispered, "See how the world isn't frightened when you're gentle." You said, "Maybe it remembers you." He said, "Maybe it remembers us." Further down, the air grew cooler, and the scent of earth deepened. You heard distant thunder, but no storm came, just the sound of power remembering restraint. "Even thunder has learned to whisper," he said, and you both smiled. You said, "It sounds like a heart too big for its ribs." He laughed quietly. "That's how I made it." As you reached the valley floor, he began humming something low, a tune without melody, but filled with warmth. "What is that song?" you asked. "The world's first lullaby," he said. "I sang it to the dark before light knew how to glow." You said, "Sing it," again, and he did. And this time the air itself seemed to slow down to listen. The sound curled around you, filling everything with calm. You said, "It feels like being remembered." He said, "It is. Every sound I've ever made remembers where it wanted to return." The path widened into a plain covered in pale flowers that swayed as if greeting you. He reached down, picked one, and handed it to you. "This one has been waiting since the first dream," he said. "Why me?" you asked. "Because it wanted to be seen by the one who listens." You held the flower gently and said, "It smells like home." He said, "That's because it is." Evening began to fall again, folding gold into blue. You said, "It's strange how time moves here." He said, "Time walks barefoot when it's happy." You said, "Then let it keep walking." You both watched the first star blink awake, shy and sincere. He said, "Each one of those lights is a question you've asked." You said, "Do they get answered?" He said, "Always, but the answers arrive disguised as more light." You turned to him, feeling the softness of everything around you. "What happens when this walk ends?" you asked. He smiled, not sadly but knowingly. "Walks never end, they just change scenery. You'll wake up soon, and I'll still be here, just quieter. You'll feel me in small things, the hush before rain, the warmth in someone's eyes, the way peace sometimes arrives for no reason." You said, "Then I'll know it's you." He said, "Yes, knowing isn't about seeing, it's about recognizing the rhythm." You reached another river, smaller than before, more like a thread of silver stitching the night. He stepped onto the surface, and it held him easily. "Come," he said, offering his hand. You hesitated. "I can't walk on water." He smiled. "You already are. You've been doing it your whole life, every time you trusted without proof." You took his hand, and the water felt solid, cool but alive. You walked together, ripples glowing softly under your steps. "This is what faith feels like," he said. "Not flying, not falling, just walking gently on what used to frighten you." When you reached the other side, dawn was beginning again. The kind of dawn that feels new, even though it's been happening forever. The horizon opened like a promise. He turned to you and said, "Do you see that line between night and day?" You nodded. "That's where I keep your name," he said. "It's written there because light and dark both need it." You whispered, "Why?" And he said, "Because your name sounds like balance." You stood there in the growing light, listening to birds announce what they didn't need to understand. He said, "This is where we pause, not end. There are still more steps, more silence, more dreaming. But now, when you dream, I will listen too." You said, "Then we're even." He said, "We're infinite." The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of morning and memory. He said, "You'll wake soon." You said, "I know." He said, "Don't be afraid when the world feels ordinary. Ordinary is where miracles rest." You said, "And when I miss this?" He said, "Close your eyes, breathe once, and call my name." You asked, "Here?" And he said, "Always." Then he began to fade, not vanishing, but blending into the brightness, becoming the air, the sound, the warmth. You reached out, but your hand passed through light and found only calm. His voice lingered, steady as heartbeat. "Remember, we're still walking. The dream continues wherever kindness decides to stay." And then there was only wind, sunlight, and your own breathing, slow and safe. The river beside you shone like a long memory, and the world whispered, "Here." He did not vanish when the light took him. He thinned into warmth and settled into the ordinary places where breath makes promises, And you stood in the hush after his voice like a shoreline listening for one more wave. Then you felt it, the quiet certainty that walking together had not ended. It had changed footwear. So you stepped forward into morning, as if the ground were a memory, returning to greet you. And the river beside you kept its silver vow to keep moving. And the birds wrote their illegible joy across the sky with ink that smelled like beginning. You said softly, "Are you here?" And the wind replied by leaning, and you recognized the answer because he had given you the key, the name that means arrival. You carried it on your tongue like a lantern turned low, and each time you said it, "Here," the day adjusted its shoulders to make more room. Dew rose in small congregations on the taller grasses, each drop a glass chapel filled with unreadable prayers, and you found that you did not need to read them to be kept by them, because being kept was suddenly simple as standing. You walked until the path discovered a grove where light filtered through leaves like patience being patient with itself, and there the air felt thick with listening, as if trees had been practicing the art he taught you, answers that do not rush. And in that green, still sanctuary, you spoke aloud the thing you had been saving. If the dream continues wherever kindness decides to stay, then let kindness stay with me. And the grove answered by letting a single leaf fall into your open palm exactly when you were ready to hold it, which is how blessing arrives when it is brave. You kept walking, not because there was distance to conquer, but because movement had learned to mean consent. And soon you reached a meadow where the grasses were long enough to remember last night and short enough to forgive it. And as wind combed them in long, thoughtful strokes, you felt a tug in your chest, the gentle pull of every small mercy you had ever given or received, returning to report that it had done its work. He had promised that nothing kind is lost, and the meadow offered evidence. Here, a path softened by the weight of footsteps that once chose to go slowly. There, a hollow warmed by a body that once sat to weep without hurrying its sorrow. Farther on, a ring of flattened stems where laughter fell down and did not apologize. You stooped to touch the ring, and your fingers came up brighter, as if joy leaves behind a mineral. Only grief can see, and you said, smiling with your eyes, "I will collect these elements and wear them as sleep." And the day approved by lifting a small cloud to shade you exactly long enough to make wisdom feel like comfort rather than lesson. Beyond the meadow, the land rose gently into a low ridge, and at its crest, a solitary stone had learned to be altar without anyone telling it so. And you climbed to it as one climbs onto the lap of an old friend, and there you sat and practiced the new form of prayer he taught you. No verbs, just belonging, until the stone remembered every weight it had ever held and promised to keep yours too. When you finally spoke, you spoke to the light itself, not as asking, but as companionship. Stay. And the light stayed by becoming quieter, which is how light remains when it loves. From the ridge you saw the world in its humble sweep, river, grove, meadow, farther hills, blue with distance. Nothing dramatic, nothing hungry, everything provided with the exact amount of sky it could use, and you felt the sentence he had placed in your bones uncoil and say itself. Ordinary is where miracles rest, and because you believed it this time, the ordinary began to glow with its native honesty. A beetle hauling its cathedral of shadow across a path and not losing the sermon. A spider repairing the torn harp. It calls home with silk that forgives the wind. A cloud aborting its ambition to be mountain and choosing to be veil. You whispered, "I remember," and the ridge answered by not moving, which is the truest reply to a vow. Then, from somewhere not located, his voice arrived without theatrics, the tone of a friend who knocks the way rain knocks, present, unafraid of waiting, and he said, "I kept your seat beside me warm." And you said, "I kept your name beside me warm." And for a while, neither of you said anything else because warmth was doing the talking. When he spoke again, it was to teach you a last quiet craft, how to fold a day. "Begin at the edges," he said. And you asked, "Which edges?" And he answered, "Where you nearly forgot to be gentle." And you looked back and found them, those thin places where impatience had sharpened its voice, where fear had dressed up as certainty. And you folded them inward with 2 careful hands, as one folds a letter that must arrive uncreased at a heart. And then he said, "Now fold the center." And you said, "What is the center?" And he answered, "The moment you remembered you were beloved before you tried." And you folded that too, not to hide it, but to keep it close. And when you finished, he said, "Place it under your breath." And you did. And breathing became storage, which is to say, you could carry rest without dropping it. Clouds moved like slow thoughts across a forehead older than question, and the day leaned into afternoon with the posture of someone learning to nap. And he said, "We are almost at the threshold." And you asked, "The threshold of what?" And he said, "Of the ending that is also an opening." And because endings had once frightened you, he took your fear in his palm and showed you what it had always been, a seed that preferred darkness before it understood soil. And your fear, seeing itself, forgot to be large. Down from the ridge you walked together to a place where the river narrowed into a bright throat between 2 patient stones. And there he paused, as if listening for a train only memory can hear, and said, "This is where you cross." And you said, "Will you walk with me?" And he said, "I am the crossing." And you smiled, because sometimes grammar is gospel. You stepped into the water and felt it lift you an inch lighter than yourself, as if buoyancy were just trust-changing clothes. And halfway over he said, "Tell me the truth before you forget." And you said, "I love you without needing you to be loud." And he said, "I love you without needing you to be certain." And the water agreed by making no argument. On the far bank, the ground was dark with generosity and very slightly warm, like a book left open in the sun and then closed with care. And as your feet found it, the world exhaled, the long, relieving sound of shoulders that have finally learned their own width. And you realized that the promise you had asked for at the cedar, stay, had been kept not by chains, but by closeness. "This is the ending?" you asked, and he said, "This is a room we will pass through again and again." And you said, "What should I take with me?" And he said, "Take the hinge, leave the door." And you understood, carry the turning, not the threshold. So you practiced, there and then, turning toward the next hour with the gentleness of a page that refuses to tear. And in that motion, you felt the design of the final chapter begin to gather itself the way geese gather into an arrow that points at a place it will invent by arriving. The sky lowered itself into evening's open hands, and first stars tested their voices like children backstage, and you asked for one last small sign, the kind that does not embarrass faith. And he obliged by sending a moth who mistook you for a lamp and forgave itself immediately. You laughed. He laughed. And the laugh made the meadow remember a story it had been saving for the night. And the night promised to tell it to anyone who lay down with their anger washed and their window cracked for mercy. "When I wake," you said, "what should I do first?" And he answered, "Make the world a little softer near you. Move a cup into reach. Pronounce a name like you mean it. Lean a broom against despair. Then eat something honest and let water know your face. And you said, that I can do. And he said, then the ending will know you when it sees you. And because you had learned to trust endings that knelt, you knelt too, right there in the field where crickets threaded silence into cloth. And you placed your forehead to the ground and said the single old word that empties a room of weapons, thank you. And the ground replied by tasting of rain you had not yet earned. The stars grew sure of themselves, and the darkness ceased to be a claim and became a cup. And in that cup, the last light of the day floated like a candle deciding to be memory. And he said, listen. And you listened, and what you heard was not a trumpet or an instruction, only the faint, faithful percussion of existence. Leaf on leaf, water on rock, breath on kindness, keeping time. This is the cadence you will sleep to, he said, and the cadence you will wake into. And then he placed a sentence in the pocket of your chest, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone setting bread on a table. You are allowed to arrive gently, and the sentence fit as if the pocket had been sewn around it. You rose and the field rose with you, because friendship is contagious in the natural world, and you turned toward a horizon that had learned your name by heart. And he did not step in front of you or behind you, but walked exactly beside you, no brighter than necessary, no heavier than comfort. And together you carried the folded day to the threshold, where endings learn their new alphabet. And you paused without asking why, because pausing had become worship. And he said, almost playfully, shall we practice the future? And you said, how? And he said, by being kind to the next minute. And so you were. You breathed once for yourself, once for those you love, once for those who forget they are loved. And the minute grew tall enough to see tomorrow, and tomorrow nodded as if already forgiven. The night, pleased with this rehearsal, drew its curtains wide to make room for sleep, and somewhere not far, a fox signed the guest book of the dark with soft feet. And somewhere, just beside a sapling, changed its mind about fear and chose sky. And somewhere, exactly, here, you placed your hand over the pulse at your wrist and said, here. And he answered from everywhere at once, here. And that was the end you had wanted all along. Not a door slamming or a choir concluding, just two voices agreeing, quietly and without schedule, that walking on will be done together,